Explore. Sorry about that. Now we're recording. Today we're going to explore a fascinating chapter in Scottish history, and this is the Jacobite movement. For those that don't know me or who haven't been part of the previous lectures, my name is Kira. I recently just finished my master's dissertation in Scottish history through the University of Dundee. And I'm just waiting on that final grade to come back so that I can graduate this summer and get that certification. But my love for Scottish history and Scotland is rooted in familial ties. My grandmother was from the Isle of Lewis, and I've just fell in love with Scottish history after visiting a few times. So um, everything that's presented here is stuff that I have learned and researched through my courses. And if there's something that I don't know, I'll definitely try and figure it out. Not all of it is necessarily my expertise, but it is super fun. So, with that, today I'm going to guide you through the rise, the fall, and the afterlife of the Stuart cause, which will begin for us in 1688, and we'll kind of round it out nicely in 1788. So, this period is really marked by dramatic events, passionate loyalties, legacy that influences Scottish culture today. A lot of us probably have ideas of what we think Jacobite Scotland was like, what the cause was about, and we're going to dive into some of that today. So, also quickly, I want to mention too that this is put on by the St. Andrews Society of Colorado. I am volunteering as a local historian, and so if you have any other presentations or lectures that you know something you'd like to learn about, let us know, and we'll get them on the books. All right. So let's start with a quick overview of our agenda and our learning goals. I always like to give a background or refresher of what's going on in British history leading up to the time period that we're talking about. Super helpful. After that, we'll explore the birth of the Jacobite cause. We're going to really try and understand its origins, and that helps us grasp not only the motivations, but also the dreams that fueled the movement. Then we're going to move on to Jacobite uprisings. Most of us, when we think about the Jacobite movement, we think of 1745, which is kind of the really big one. But we'll also talk about the major uprising in 1715. There are some smaller skirmishes and risings that appear throughout. We're not going to give those too much attention, but I have some resources if you're interested. And then finally, we'll discuss the aftermath and the cultural legacy. The Jacobite cause, of course, had a profound impact that influenced culture, politics, and even today's perceptions of Scottish identity. And then, of course, throughout the whole thing, we're going to be touching on Jacobite ideology, politics, to really understand the beliefs and the political maneuvers that defined this era. So, what is a Jacobite? What does the Jacobite movement stand for? As I mentioned, I think we all kind of have a picture in our mind of what that might be. Oftentimes we think of, maybe a Catholic Highland warrior, all clad in tartan and plaid. In popular culture, we might think about scenes or characters from Outlander, like Jamie Fraser, or we might think about Sir Walter Scott's novels, Waverley, Rob Roy, or maybe music comes to your mind, something like the Skyboat Song or Loch Lomond. The line in Loch Lomond that says, "You take the high road, I'll take the low road, and I'll be in Scotland afore you," is really a Jacobite lament. It's a story about a Scottish soldier who is on his way to be executed, and what he's saying is, "When I die, I will take the spiritual low road, and you'll still be on the earthly high road, but I'll make it to Scotland before you." So we might think about some of those things. But it's not necessarily um, a very neat idea, right? We'll get into some of the particulars and nuances throughout the lecture. And you might be surprised about who supported the Jacobite movement and who would have considered themselves a Jacobite. But in short, if we're going to answer this question, a Jacobite is someone who supported King James VII. He was also King James II of England, right to the British throne. So it comes from the Latin word Jacobus, James, and more broadly, those aligned with Jacobitism who favored the restoration of a Stuart monarch. And we're going to talk about why that restoration needed to happen or they wanted to happen. Okay, so if you've attended any of the lectures I've given, I always do a British history refresher. The monarchical line can really bog you down and it gets confusing, but in this case, I think it's really important because it helps set the stage for uh, what's going on, the sentiment, and what's happening before the Jacobite cause kicks off. So. We're going to start with the Union of the Crowns. And this is, if you remember from our last lecture with Mary Queen of Scots, this is Mary Queen of Scots' son. So King James the Sixth of Scotland, he becomes King James the First of England when Queen Elizabeth doesn't have an heir to the throne. So in 1603, King James the Sixth of Scotland becomes King James the First of England, and England and Scotland are united under one crown. So there's one monarch, but there's two separate parliaments. So remember that. We've got a parliament in Scotland and a parliament in England. And so this is a pivotal moment in Scottish history. And I added in here, their religious leanings because that becomes important. We've talked about that often. A lot of the conflicts and points of contention have to do with Protestant and Catholic rule versus what's going on in society. And so in this case, we've got the Union of the Crowns, and this really is a good starting point for us. I do want to jump ahead really quick, fast forward to 1649. And we see a brief interregnum period, a brief period without the monarch. This is Oliver Cromwell's rule, or the period of the Commonwealth in Britain. And this was a period of great change and uncertainty because the kingdom had just executed Charles I, and for a series of issues. One of those issues being that although he was Protestant or Anglican, he was married to a French Catholic, and so he had some issues with that. There are issues with the Scottish Covenanters, and there are issues with Puritans as well. And so this interregnum period is really confusing and chaotic for people in Britain because the monarch was really uh, in their minds, the physical embodiment of the health of the kingdom, right? So if the king was doing well, then the nation's doing well. And in this case, they just executed theirs and they don't have a monarch and they're trying to make meaning of that. And so this period sees an explosion of mysticism and religious denominations and superstitions. People are just really trying to make meaning of things. There's a really great book for people who want to dive into it called The Battle of the Frogs and Fairford's Flies, and it dives into um, how this uncertainty and kind of chaos mixed with, the printing press um, created just a bunch of people looking for meaning and religious denominations and whatnot. Um, so this was a very tumultuous time. Following that, they decide, okay, we need a king. So they restore the monarchy, and we have Charles II, who is restored as king. Now, I also want to point out before I get too far, these are all part of the Stuart line, right? So we got James Stuart and Charles, and they're all coming from Mary, Queen of Scots. So Charles II is restored. He's Anglican, Protestant, but also kind of suspected Catholic, and this is where we see things turn just a little bit. But it was his brother, King James VII and the Second, um, where our story really starts. So King James VII is, and I say the seventh because we're part of a Scottish society, and so we're going to use the Scottish styling first. But King James VII is a decided Catholic, right? Despite what's going on and where the trend has been, he's Catholic. And so that paves the way for the Glorious Revolution. And we're going to get into some of those details in just a moment. But what ends up happening is he's overthrown, and it passes down to his daughter and his son-in-law, who is William of Orange. And it's basically a coup. So now they're Protestants, and Britain's happy with that. Queen Anne is the last, we call her the last Stuart because, um, and this is Mary's sister and James's daughter. She ends up, I don't remember the exact number, it's tragic. I think she had 17 miscarriages, so she doesn't have an heir. And so when she dies, this really shifts British history, and it marks a significant turning point. Now it goes from the Stuart line to the Hanovers, the House of Hanover, which is a a German royal house. And so this especially is really crucial in shaping the political tensions that fueled the Jacobite uprisings. So we have George the First and then George the Second, and as we know, eventually we got George the Third, and that's the American Revolution. So our story really is right between here and here. So there's a lot going on, and I say all of this just to give us enough background to understand that there's some social unrest, there's some unease, there's still very entrenched religious beliefs that are causing political tension and causing, um, regime changes and things like that. So, our story starts in 1688. Why? It starts with the rule of King James VII. He's a Catholic monarch who's ruling a predominantly Protestant nation. So the elite of the country, they were simply biding their time, right? James has two daughters. They're both Protestant. So they're just waiting for James's reign to end naturally. They're waiting for him to die because then the throne will just naturally pass on to Mary, who's Protestant, and she'll assume the throne. All of this takes a turn and gets thwarted when a baby boy is born to James. So, June 10th, 1688, call this the catalyst. Um, James Francis Edward Stuart is born to King James. And what this does is it introduces a very real possibility of a lasting Catholic dynasty. So, needless to say, the Protestant nobles, the elite, they're not too happy about this. That was not what they were expecting. They don't want a long-lasting Catholic dynasty. They've gone through all of this before. And so they're alarmed by this, and they end up inviting William of Orange to intervene. And remember, he's married to James's daughter, Mary. So this kicks off what we call the Glorious Revolution. And glorious in quotes because it's glorious for English history and those who support that Protestant cause. Um, and so William landed in England on November 5th, 1688, and there's a series of things that happens, which we'll get into, so that he can assume the throne. Now, these events set the stage for significant changes in the British monarchy, laid the groundwork for the rise of Jacobitism, which we'll explore. So, while this is happening, where is James? What's happening to James? He basically suffers a nervous breakdown after people that he trusted, nobles that he trusted, his own daughter, kind of defected to the new order, the new regime. So, James fled to France with his family and we've got baby James there as well. So there he sets up a royal court in exile. So they're more or less treated as ruling monarchs on the continent, and they're just basically pretending that they're still ruling Britain, but they're doing it somewhere else. So James Francis Edward Stuart would have been styled James the Eighth. So if I say James the Eighth, this is who I'm talking about. He can be referred to as the Old Pretender. And then he has a son, Charles Edward Stuart. His actual real name is really long, but we refer to him as typically Bonnie Prince Charlie or the Young Pretender, who also grows up on the continent. So both of the James and Charles grow up on the continent, and you'll learn a little bit more about them as we move on. But this is just important background for what's happening, so you know where they are. Meanwhile, understanding what's happening in Britain. So I want to go back to the Glorious Revolution. And again, I said glorious for who? So what happened and how does this kick off the Jacobite movement? So, William's invitation by the Protestant nobles and politicians started the process, but it needed to be legal. So, there's a series of political maneuvers that takes place in order for William and Mary to secure the throne. Now, remember, we still have one monarch, or in this case, we have um, two ruling monarchs, co-monarchs, but there's still two parliaments. So, they've got to go through England's parliament and the Scottish parliament. So in England, they determined that because James fled, that means he had abdicated his throne, and that was good enough for them to offer the crown to William. And so you'd think, okay, well, maybe they'd have a little bit of a harder time in Scotland passing something like this through. But there were a lot of people who were on board with what was going on, and a convention of estates basically did the same thing. They claimed that James had forfeited his crown because of his pro-Catholic policies, which they weren't aligned with, and so they deposed him, and now William and Mary are on the throne. But of course, this didn't necessarily sit well with a lot of people who believed in the divine right of kings. And I want to point out it wasn't just Catholic Scots who were dissatisfied with this, or Highlanders. Many Protestants were also appalled with what was going on. They were appalled with the militarization of Britain during this period. William and Mary's ascension, William's ascension, was more like a coup. And so after that, he really had to protect it. And across Britain, we see increased military spending, increased military presence. And so there are a lot of Protestants, English and Scottish, who didn't like that. They wanted things to go back to the way that they were. So the Jacobite movement was a response to what supporters viewed as the illegal usurpation of the crown. And so that's why the Glorious Revolution or the Revolution is considered a major catalyst. This also kicks off some years of civil war, which I'm not really going to get into, but just know that there's a lot going on there if you're interested in diving in a little bit more. But it's also, this includes Ireland, which I think is interesting. It makes sense. They're fueled by a deep alienation. They're a majority Catholic country, about 75%, and they were deeply alienated by the Protestant ascendancy that's happening. So James kind of saw this as a opportunity, the ousted King James the Seventh. He used Ireland as a stepping stone. So after some fighting in Ireland, after the Treaty of Limerick in 1691, there's some infighting going on. Thousands of troops from Ireland entered French and Spanish service as Jacobites. So what we see here is not only the beginnings of a movement, but also the diffusion or the dissemination of those ideals, not only in Scotland, but also in England, in Ireland, and it's across the gamut. So while we're talking about what's going on outside of Scotland, I do want to dive into the complexities of the movement across three kingdoms. So we'll talk about Scotland, England, and Ireland. So starting with Scotland, the motivation to support the cause is steeped in anti-union sentiment. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But really, it's this desire to have a more independent Scotland as their view that Scotland and England are becoming more entrenched, more intertwined. And so Jacobite supporters wanted more independence. They're anti-union. Also, religious defense, as we talked about. And then also a motivation, patriotic motivation. What does it mean to be Scottish during this period of England and Scotland kind of coming together? Scottish supporters were typically Episcopalian, which is technically a Protestant denomination, but many people felt like they had Catholic tendencies, and so they're a little bit on the outs, and also a Catholic mix. The Episcopalian Church is an interesting part of this whole story. They believed it was their duty and their right to support the king regardless of maybe what else was going on from a Protestant standpoint religiously. So even if he was Catholic. And then we also have Highland chiefs and lowland nobles that stood united in this cause. As I mentioned, I think we like to separate things into neat boxes. It's like, okay, if we've got Catholic Highlanders and we have Protestant lowlanders, we'll just put them in those buckets. And we do that as humans because it's easier for us to kind of move through. But I think it's really important to notice and to recognize the nuance here, that people were part of this for a lot of different reasons, right? We've got a mixture of people, Highlanders, Lowlanders, noblemen, um, uh, the working class, and we'll talk about that more as well. So Scotland too is the military trigger, right? They're boots on the ground. If any rising is going to happen, it's going to start with Scotland. So let's shift to England. And when I first learned about this, I was pretty surprised, to be honest with you, that there was representation in England. And the reason why is because many were feeling politically excluded by the Whigs. I'm not going to get into the politics of the Whigs and the Tories. I get so lost in all of that. But it's a part of the story. A lot of people in England who supported the cause felt nostalgia for the old order, as I had mentioned. Um, those who did support Jacobitism in England were typically high Tory Anglicans, and there was also a Catholic minority. So their attachment is mostly political because they're feeling excluded. England provided some financial backing, but they were generally cautious about military engagements, which you'll see later. Um, and then let's talk about Ireland. The drive here was even more visceral, if you want to say. There is a strong desire for religious emancipation. Again, there's a Catholic majority here of over 75%. They're looking for a restoration of their churches and their land, and they were really dissatisfied with where things were going and how they were being treated as a majority Catholic country. Um, and as I mentioned, they did contribute to the army overseas. They're also called the Wild Geese. And these were the Irish soldiers who served in France and Spain, and they'll come back into the story as well. So, in essence, while the overarching cause of Jacobitism was shared, the motives in each kingdom differed significantly. So, they all had their unique reasons, but basically a common goal. I really like A.I. McInnes's thoughts on the three kingdoms here. He's a great historian. He said, whereas the English drank for Jacobitism and the Irish dreamt of Jacobitism, the Scots died for Jacobitism. So for the Scots, it was not merely a political movement. It was deeply, deeply intertwined with national identity, cultural survival. It's about defending who they are, their way of life, their religion, their land. There's lots of different reasons for that, but it's very deeply entrenched. And the English and Irish had their own reasons for supporting, um, but for many in Scotland, it was existential. So right now I'm really pulling us through the background of ideology, the different players, as we move towards 1715, the major uprising. And so I want to bring in the Jacobites' place within geopolitics. So European powers took notice as well. The Jacobite movement put Scotland on the map. We've talked about this before too, with the relationship and the old alliance between Scotland and France. They were often coming to each other's aid. France often eyed Scotland as kind of a backdoor to England. And so, excuse me, England would keep an eye on that as well. So, for European powers, the Jacobite movement was a strategic lever that they could pull to destabilize Britain without total war if they wanted to or needed to. Again, the Scots were the trigger here. Remember, we have the exiled royal court in France, in Rome. Later, it's in Rome, and this is where the Stuarts are. And we have Irish Jacobite troops in Spain and France. So, the relationship here is interesting because the Scots are the trigger. It was a vicious cycle. So the Scots were slow to start an uprising unless they knew that they had continental support, i.e., from France. But France typically didn't want to start anything until they saw a successful uprising. So what we're seeing here is a lot of like, okay, if you can show us that you can do this, we'll jump in and help. And they're saying, well, we need you to help before we can do this, and just keep that in mind as we move throughout this. So up until this point, I've laid the groundwork. We see how the usurpation of James in 1688 kickstarted a local and global Jacobite ideology. But as we head towards the first major uprising in 1715, it's important to understand just how disaffected and disillusioned many Scots felt by the current regime's policies. These tangible grievances really bubbled and grew into a military response in Scotland. So I just want to walk through this and hang with me here. Um, so the first one that I want to mention is the Glencoe Massacre in 1692. This was under the Williamite regime. Um, so many of us know this story. You know, it's told. There's books. But essentially, the Scottish secretary believed that the Episcopalian MacDonalds of Glencoe were Catholics and either refusing to surrender to the government or not stating their loyalty. What we know now is this was a big misunderstanding. They were on their way to doing that, and in the meantime, there was a massacre, and this uh, was outrageous for many Scots. Then we have something called the Darien Venture. And also under the Williamite regime, this is William and Mary. Um, so there's a newly founded Royal Company of Scotland trading to Africa and the Indies. Very succinct name, apropos. And they wanted to establish a trading depot on the Isthmus of Darien, which is modern day Panama. Spain owned the isthmus, and William, knowing this, kept London out of the conversation. He kept England out of the conversation of investment because he believed that Spain would inevitably come in and throw out any foreign companies. And so he kept England out, but he didn't necessarily warn the Scots. So what ends up happening is uh, just that. Spain takes over, and Scots and the investors lose out big time. I think it was about 25% of the nation's liquid capital, which is a lot. And so now the Scottish economy is in the tanks, and they are blaming William. And also, just as an aside, it's noted that William tried to rule Scotland like he did England, but he didn't really have any interest in Scottish affairs. And we know from past history that the Scots don't take too kindly to that. And so this just like grows on top of everything else going on. The hits keep coming though. The 1701 Act of Settlement, also under the Williamite regime, mandated that the monarch must be Anglican, and essentially barred the exiled Stuarts from ever being able to rule again. The Scots Parliament was not consulted. In 1705, the Alien Act under Queen Anne classified Scottish nationals in England as foreign aliens. So they banned trade, confiscated property, unless the Scots agreed to the succession plan of when Anne dies, passing over to the Hanovers, or they agreed to parliamentary union. So the Alien Act was really used as a strong arm to try and get the Scots to do what London wants. Now, this one, if you get anything out of this whole timeline and slide, should be this. The 1707 Act of Union is monumental and it cannot be overstated. It's hugely important. It's a major turning point, not only in this period, but just for Scottish history as a whole. So, it effectively dissolved the Scottish Parliament. So we've got the Parliament in Edinburgh and Parliament in London. That's no more. Now there's one monarch and one parliament, and it's all based in London. Why did this happen? A lot of the noblemen and politicians who had invested in the Darien venture and were really struggling, um, essentially were bought out. London came in and said, "Hey, we'll give you back the money you lost. Plus, hey, here's some titles, here's some land," and that worked. Scots across the country, though, were outraged. They felt that their noblemen and their representatives had sold out, and that led to um, just significant outrage. Robert Burns has a famous line related to this in one of his poems. He says, "We're bought and sold for English gold, such a parcel of rogues in a nation." So there's a public outcry here. Keeps coming though. In 1708, there's the Treason Act. And it basically further centralized legal authority in London. The Scots were very proud historically of their unique legal system. And so this brought that together in a way. And it was a clear step in the consolidation of power, which, of course, did not sit well with many Scots. And it intensifies. In 1713, London passed the malt tax, and this was the first time that Scotland would be subjected to English levels of taxation on the staple crop. Um, and this policy disproportionately affected the working poor, the working class, affected the local production of alcohol, and it just disproportionately impacted the Scottish economy as a whole. It also led to a bunch of riots. And so what we're seeing here is a bubbling up. People are saying, okay, we don't stand for this. We don't feel like this is fair and just. And so they're responding, which was common in this time, by mobs, riots, to show that the noble class and the hierarchical class above them, that they're not being treated the way that there's kind of a social contract there. And so we're seeing that build up. But we're going to move on to the straw that broke the camel's back for the Jacobite cause leading up to 1715. And that was the transition over to the Hanoverian regime. So when Queen Anne, the last Stuart, passed away, she didn't have an heir, so the throne was handed over to the German royal house of Hanover. And so a lot of people, not just Scots, they're saying, okay, we have a foreigner here. Who's ruling our nation, and that added to their grievances. So these events, amongst others, kind of creates that backdrop of discontent, sets the stage for what's about to happen next. So leading up to 1715, the seeds of rebellion have been planted. It's been brewing because of the severe disillusionment with the Union and the ways that London controlled and managed Scotland. Um, and so I've got a couple pictures here. This is like 18th century coffee house, which those were pretty popular in the Jacobite culture. And then we've got some publications here, particularly for Jacobites. So after the Union in 1707, Jacobitism became the standard bearer for Scottish patriotism. Many Scots joined the movement, not because of their landlords or their chieftains necessarily, but out of a desire for an independent Scotland, right? Everything is kind of merging together, and they're saying, wait a minute, what makes us unique is something else, and we want to hang on to that. And so this is brewing, this is fueling what's going on. So the Jacobites met in coffee houses, they created publications, and they did what they could to politically subvert the new order. So right now we're living in this political world where they're trying to figure out how do we do this without any violence, without any uprising. Because previously the Jacobites could kind of hope for a restoration, maybe through a change of heart of Queen Anne. Maybe she would have a change of heart towards her brother. Um, and show some semblance of leeway. But after 1714, when the reins are handed over to the Hanovers, it became clear that the Whigs in office were really joined at the hip to this new dynasty, and that really made military force the only realistic pathway to a Stuart restoration. All right, I'm going to take a drink and pause for a second. The one thing I didn't do on this lecture is I didn't add a Harry Kubrick, which I normally do. So my apologies for that. Just picture one in your head. This is a good time to pause. Okay, so hopefully everyone's hanging with me so far. There's a lot going on, which is why this is so interesting, and which is why, we're going to kind of go a mile wide and not necessarily a mile deep. Um, but let's move on to the first major uprising. Again, there were some smaller ones, but so this leads us to the first major military uprising of the Jacobites in 1715. This began in early September of 1715 with the very public proclamation of James III or James VIII as king. And so remember, this is James VII's son. He grew up on the continent. His birth is what really started all of this. So we've got Jacobite forces or the rebellion forces and the government forces. We have James Francis Edward Stuart, the Old Pretender, and John Erskine, the Earl of Mar. So the House of Mar is one of the oldest noble houses in Scotland, and he kind of became the political leader for the Jacobites during the 15. And he's an interesting one, and I want to bring this up because I think it shows again some of the nuances of what's happening here. Mar was previously a supporter of the Union. And you might go, what? But some of this flip-flopping isn't necessarily so unusual with the upper classes, the elite, the noble. So he was previously a supporter of the Union. He had great political acumen. He was once the Scottish Secretary of State. He was a member of the Privy Council, and he even expressed loyalty to George I. But that was contingent eventually on his desire for the Union to be dissolved. So he had changed his mind. However, like many Tories during this time period, he was relieved of his political duties and he joined the Jacobite movement in August of 1715. So, really, just shortly before this. So, we have the Old Pretender and the Earl of Mar. And on the other side, of course, we have King George I, and we have the Duke of Argyll, or John Campbell. And he was a Scottish aristocrat who supported the Union of 1707. So, again, we're not like really, there's not really any clean lines here. Um, and so these are the two forces. So let's get into some of the specifics here. The 1715 uprising, or what we also call the 15, was the largest mobilization of the Jacobite movement in Scotland. Again, we often know stories and talk about the 45. There's reason for that. But 1715 was actually the largest mobilization. The Earl of Mar had established a headquarters at Perth and gathered approximately 20,000 men, which is good. I mean, that's no small potatoes in this time period. By the end of September in 1745, the Jacobites controlled most of Scotland between the Moray Firth and the Firth of Forth. So up here in Inverness, basically all the way down to almost Edinburgh. The goal was for the Jacobite forces in Scotland to march south to England and meet up with English Jacobite forces. But this momentum was broken by two events. So, a small Jacobite army had marched into England, was cornered, and forced to surrender. This isn't exactly where it was. I just wanted to make sure that it was not in Scotland, so you knew it was in England. And then, secondarily, the Earl of Mar's army, the Jacobite forces, clashed with Argyll's government forces at Sheriffmuir, which was a very indecisive battle. It wasn't defeat, but both sides were very battered. It was here, though, that the Jacobites really lost their confidence in their tactical initiative. After all of this, uh, James, the old pretender, arrived in Perth in December. So after all of these things that have happened, but it didn't revitalize, rejuvenate the movement like they had wanted it to. And during this period, they were faced with reinforced government troops. So they were reinforced with Dutch and Swiss auxiliaries. And so Jacobite commanders eventually abandoned Perth and retreated north in 1716. After this, the army really started to fall apart as James and Mar fled to the continent on their little boat. There they go. In February 1716, which left the remaining to disperse. So this is a very uh, buttoned up all of the 1715 uprising in one um, couple slides here. But it has a real impact. The failure of the 1715 rising was catastrophic to the movement in the short term, but it would actually kind of show resilience long term. Some of the impact here is that the Jacobites were left in political shambles. So their leaders were hiding or in exile, and they had no resources. This event also ushered in the Whigs' growing political consolidation. And then, unfortunately, additionally, the Episcopalian Church suffered significant persecution in the aftermath, which weakened one of the movement's primary sources of recruitment. So it was one of their primary recruiting engines was Episcopals. Um, Curiously, though, the aftermath of this saw some Whig Scots working to obtain pardons for their Jacobite kinsmen and their neighbors. So it's an early sign of a shared Scottish identity, especially within that social class. And that helped the Jacobite elite after this period reintegrate into the British establishment after those defeats. And this kind of helps keep the movement alive. The movement did survive, and the 15 demonstrated also um, demonstrated to, and this is important, to European powers that the Scots and the Jacobites could mobilize a significant domestic army. So remember that vicious cycle I'm talking about. And this helped ensure that the Jacobite movement remained as a potentially useful pawn in that great European power game, so to speak. So after 1715, what happens, right? We talk about 1715. We know that there's a big uprising in 1745. What happens between that time period? It's a period characterized by Reconstruction, political subversion, and widespread social unrest. For all intents and purposes, Jacobitism was an illegal underground organization. A great historian, Daniel Zecchi, says that to be a Jacobite was akin to being a communist in Franco Spain or a member of the IRA in Northern Ireland up to 1997. So what he's saying here is that it is not something that you wanted to project, hence underground. I call it the resilient underground because they found ways to continue to grow despite that public um, persona. So it's a non-sanctioned political movement and ideology. They were definitely excluded from conventional politics, right? But they were able to maintain the basics of a political movement in other respects. So they had recognized leaders, they had a mass popular base, they had a common ideological vision, and they had an agenda stemming from that vision. And then they also had a propaganda output to win support from the public sphere, right? We talked about that recruitment machine. And all of this sustained the movement through these years. Now, just like in regular British hierarchical society, the Jacobites also had distinct society members and social spaces. We kind of historians have identified three layers of Jacobite society. You had the ideologically committed, so those are the people that really would die for this. You have the politically embittered, so you have people who may not necessarily agree with everything that the movement stands for, but they feel excluded from the political scene. They might be a Tory who, was relieved of their duties, whatever the case is. And then you also have people they call adventurers, which could just be someone who is kind of nomadic, or maybe they're just looking for something to attach to, some meaning. And Jacobite social spaces and markets existed. Wherever there were substantial numbers of Jacobites, there were Jacobite-run coffee houses, ale houses, inns, taverns, that kind of a thing. And even in London, especially in London. And I was surprised by that. They also had Jacobite newspapers and publications. They would say treasonable toasts to the king. They had seditious songs, stories. They fundraised for prisoners and the cause. And so, one of those treasonable toasts, and these are glassware from the Jacobite region. This is actually Charles, so this would have been used later, but this is a good visual of what they might have used. And one of the things that they used to do, because James was in France, he was across the water. They would take their dram and they would put it over a glass of water and they would say to the king. And what that meant was to the king over the water, which is their toast to James, who's somewhere else. So this period had a lot of very underground nods to the Jacobite movement. And so there was a market for those discreet knickknacks like this inscribed glassware, brooches with hidden symbols, tartan waistcoats, white roses on June the 10th, which is James the Third's or James the Eighth's birthday. And the white rose was kind of one of those symbols of the Jacobite movement. And we mentioned this, but on the global stage during this period, it ramps up a little bit. So now you got Spain, Sweden, Russia, and Prussia. They had all kind of scouted the Jacobite option, whenever they came into conflict with Britain. And most importantly, this was a period of much social unrest, which the Jacobites capitalized on. So there was economic depression, which lasted well into the 1740s, and the taxes disproportionately affected the working poor. More major riots took place. Some examples in the 20s were farmers who revolted against landlords who evicted them to make room for the cattle trade. Sounds a lot like the Highland clearances that would happen later on. Um, Glaswegians had targeted the property of a Whig MP who supported the malt tax, and in Edinburgh in the 30s, um, a mob lynched a captain after he ordered troops to fire into a crowd during an execution. And so they're building on this, but then the high-handed response from London during this tumultual period further alienated many of the Scots. So what we have here and what we're seeing is another groundswell of dissatisfaction with the Union and disaffected Scots who had a movement to attach to. So, leading up again to 1745, by the late 1730s, a new generation of Jacobite activists felt confident enough to plot another rising. So in 1737, we have John Gordon, who's an Aberdeenshire laird. He was involved in 1715. He kind of leads a diplomatic envoy to King James in Rome. And then in 1738, Highland and Lowland activists formed a group called the Association to coordinate with the exiled court. They're trying to set up the scaffold communication system and really make sure they have things in place to plan for um, another uprising. And then something interesting happens in 1739. There's an outbreak of war between Britain and Spain, and that kind of helps trigger the chain of events that leads to France becoming seriously interested again in the Jacobite cause. So this is setting the stage for 1745. That 1739 war, basically, it's the War of Jenkins' Ear, and I won't go into it, but it spills over into the War, the Austrian Succession, which involves most of the European powers in conflict. And this war ultimately lasts until 1748. We have Great Britain and France are caught up in it, as well as a bunch of others. But there's momentum and opportunity for an invasion of Britain by France to restore the Stuarts. So remember, they're always kind of keeping their eye on what's happening here, and if Britain's distracted, um, it might be a good time So in 1744, the French actually do plan an invasion with 15,000 troops, which is huge. But they didn't do it with the Scots' input. Ultimately, this invasion fails. Bad weather and British intelligence blocked the crossing, and then the French interest had to switch back to the Dutch front during the Austrian Succession War. So, after some frustration and wanting to get things moving, Prince Charles decides he's going to take matters into his own hands. So, Bonnie Prince Charlie, here he is, um, decides to launch his own expedition in hopes that it would force France's hand. So it was a gamble. Surely, in his mind, he's thinking surely they would provide military support if he were to get the rebellion started. So Charles secured funding from privateers, expat bankers. He used his pension from the French government and he scraped together enough money for two ships, 3,500 stand of arms, 2,400 swords, professional troops, and funds to pay them. So he's really leading the cause here. On July 5th, 1745, Charles and his two companies of Franco-Irish Marines, remember those Irish who had uh, decided to serve in Spain and France, and they sailed for Scotland. But unfortunately, during the voyage, and so much of this is just a series of unfortunate events in some cases, Charles's escort ship was forced to turn back after they had a skirmish with the British HMS Lion. So they took with them basically all of his professional troops and munitions, but he decides to continue on. So Charles continues on. He lands in Eriskay on July 23rd with almost no men, very little money or equipment. So he lands in Scotland, and because he doesn't have any French troops with him, the enthusiasm died down. So there's little enthusiasm for a rising against, the well-funded British government when Charles didn't have any French troops with him or any continental powers with him. So initially, the clan chieftains kind of rebuffed him because he arrived without that support. But Charles, being who he is, used his charisma, personal diplomacy, and he won over those leaders. And many of them had demanded that they get a pledge of compensation before they raised their clans. So they're saying, hey, I want you to pledge that you're going to pay me before we do this. So before we get into some of, the battles that really framed this, I want to talk first about Bonnie Prince Charlie and the Jacobite army for a second, because I think it does really help us understand maybe what goes on. So I haven't watched much of Outlander, but what I have watched, I thought they did a pretty good job with the depiction of Charles. So this is the character of Bonnie Prince Charlie in Outlander. Um, and he looks very dapper and stylish and put together. So Charles is called the Young Pretender, and he was born in Rome. So he spent much of his life in Italy as part of upper class society. He was accustomed to a certain way of living. He was known to be fond of fashion, clothes, and alcohol. And later, those were kind of to his detriment. Throughout the rebellion, he clashed with Jacobite leaders and had what we might call a hothead. Sometimes he was described as throwing tantrums when he didn't get his way. And so that kind of gives you a little insight into maybe what his personality was like and who he was. This is supposed to be the actual tartan waistcoat that he wore. And so, he really did show up with all the bells and whistles, and he was ready to go. These are just some depictions of maybe what the Jacobites would have looked like during this period. And I think a lot of us maybe think that they were just a ragtag group of Highlanders, and they might have appeared that way at the very end, but the Jacobite forces were very strongly disciplined and conventionally organized. So it was a mixture, a combo of British and French tactical doctrines. They were typically uniformed in some kind of tartan, either kilted, um, or they might be in trousers or trews, and those were typically high-ranking officers or leaders. Um, but the French didn't typically have tartan. I think it's kind of important to note that tartan did not necessarily mean that they were Highlanders or part of a particular clan. Remember that Lowlanders participated as well. Rather, it was as much an ideological expression as a geographical one. So it was uh, uh, they're showing their support, right? They're part of this team, so to speak. And remember, Prince Charles had his whole tartan get up. Highland clan forces were typically regional light infantry militia. They would be raised by local magnates, landlords, or their chieftains. And the Jacobite forces had battalions, they had brigades, but their cavalry forces were weaker than in 1715. So that might have contributed to some of the failures a little bit. But up to 15,000 men fought for the Jacobite forces in this period, which is estimated to be more than half of the effective national fencible resources of Scotland. So that is to say, the half of the amount of men who could be seen as raised to fight. So that's no small potatoes. That's pretty good. Um, so let's get into what happens in 1745. And I'm going to do this all in one slide. uh, so bear with me here. Take a drink. By August 1745, Charles had acquired over 1,000 troops, and the MacGregors had defeated two companies of government forces. And so momentum was starting to build from a military perspective. On September 15th, Jacobites seized Perth in Edinburgh. Murray Pittock, another great historian of this period, says that by the time the prince entered the city, a crowd up to 20,000 greeted his entry, which was accompanied by strongly nationalist symbolism. So we are seeing some popular support here. On September 21st, the Jacobites destroyed the government army at the Battle of Prestonpans, and so this was a decisive victory. And so gradually, what we're seeing is Scotland is coming under Jacobite control. Meanwhile, the British government is still wrapped up in that Continental War and dealing with their own financial crisis. So they're fighting on a couple different fronts. As they're gaining momentum, the Jacobite leaders narrowly decided, they were a little indecisive on this, decided to march on England in October of 1745. Charles was carrying a declaration that the British Parliament was unlawful and the Union null. So he's coming down to save the day and say, we are the rightful heirs to the throne, or he's the rightful heir to the throne, and basically enact that regime change. They reached Derby by December 5th of 1745, but at a council at Derby, a council of war, the Jacobite officers voted overwhelmingly to retreat back to Scotland. And this was against Charles' wishes. He was super upset by this. Um, the Jacobite officers, leaders, they felt like they were misled. They were demoralized by false reports that there was a third Hanoverian army. They were also kind of realized that Charles didn't seem to have an actual guarantee of English rising or French landing, so basically no additional support. And to top it off, they'd only acquired 400 to 500 English recruits, so not as much as they were expecting. So Prince Charles essentially throws a fit. He snubs his commanders, he refuses to participate any further, and he drinks, um, which was kind of his MO. But the retreat was managed really well by Lord George Murray. And the interesting thing is the communication here, though, because there was an invasion from France coming. So between December 20th and the 24th, a force of 10,000 troops was primed to land in England. But they heard news that the Jacobites had retreated. That gave them pause. And then combined with some other logistical issues, breakdowns, infighting, the invasion was eventually canceled. So in January 17th, despite all of this, in January 17th, 1746, the Jacobites achieved a victory at Falkirk. And despite their animosity, Charles and Lord Murray collaborated successfully to achieve that. This was short-lived, however. After Falkirk, another dispute erupted. Murray and the regimental commanders wanted to retreat further into the Highlands to kind of recoup, and Charles insisted on staying in the lowlands to fight the Duke of Cumberland's government forces. So Charles lost out. He was furious, but they marched north and consolidated their hold on the northwestern Highlands, which brings us to the Battle of Culloden. So this leads us to the end of the road. Um, a lot of us have heard the story. We know the story. If you've been to Scotland, you've probably been to the Culloden battlefield. But on April 16th, 1746, the Jacobite military cause reaches its end. So, despite the protest of officers, Charles insists on fighting an orthodox defensive action against the government's forces. And this decision resulted in the utter destruction of the Jacobite army. I am not a military strategist or anything like that. I don't understand all of the different nuances of it. But it was a decisive defeat. There were 9,000 government troops and 5,000 Jacobite soldiers, and this battle lasted less than an hour. So that can kind of tell you how bad that bloodshed was. When this is all said and done, essentially Charles abandoned his troops. He blamed the defeat on the treachery of his officers. But some things to note about Culloden, and if you've been there, it's a really somber place. There's lots of cairns and stones that are erected in the memory of the clans that fought there and other things. And if you do go to Scotland, I would highly recommend it. And another, just an aside, this was the last pitched battle on British soil. But the story doesn't necessarily end there. While Murray led a group of Jacobites to Ruthven, Charles abandoned the cause. He was kind of paranoid. He felt like maybe he'd been betrayed. So he went and hid in the Highlands, which is what this little graphic was supposed to do, but did too fast. He went and hid in the Highlands and avoided imprisonment. There was a 30,000 pound reward for his capture. So he came across people who didn't turn him in. And then he fled to the Hebrides and he spent some time here in Lewis, Harris, and North US, South US, Benbecula. I'm partial to the Hebrides because that's where my grandmother was from. And so it's a really interesting story of how he got there and what he did. But he spends a few months hiding out until he gets some funds from Spain and France to assist him to try and get him back. He's then aided by Flora MacDonald in Benbecula, which was actually controlled by a pro-government independent Highland company that was run by Flora's stepfather. So she is able to get some passages for them to go from Benbecula over to Skye, and Flora and that small party were able to do that, and they had disguised Prince Charles as an Irish maid named Betty Burke. So this is the story, this is the legend. So once he gets over to Skye, he's then able to cross back over to the mainland. He spends a few more months evading capture and then eventually left the country for France in September of 1746. So unfortunately for Flora, she was imprisoned, and but eventually in 1747 she was released, and that was after the aristocrats and there was some other legislation that kind of interceded on her behalf. Um, and Flora's story is interesting. After she gets back to Skye, eventually she gets married. They move to, I think it was North Carolina, and then they're involved in the American Revolution on the British side. Eventually they come back, and if you're ever on the Isle of Skye, up in the northeast kind of region, that's where she's buried. And they've got, it's pretty cool to see where that is. Um, so the aftermath of 1745 is really just disintegration. The Jacobite army had dispersed. The British government, which was led by the Duke of Cumberland, engaged in a brutal harrying of the Highlands. So he essentially searching for rebels, confiscating cattle and estates, burning Episcopalian and Catholic meeting houses or churches. 3,500 Jacobites were indicted for treason, 120 were executed, 650 died awaiting trial, 900 were pardoned, and the rest were transported to the colonies. Um, and so I'm sure there's a study out there, and I'm going to look it up. There's got to be some Jacobite involvement in the American Revolution at some point. Certain high-ranking Jacobite lords were executed for treason in 1747, like Simon Fraser, Lord Lovat, whereas his son, also Simon Fraser, pioneered a path back to legitimacy. So he raised his clan to fight for the Hanoverian dynasty in the Seven Years' War and the American Revolution. And so we see some of that happening after 1745 as well, where people who were involved, they're trying to find their way back into the British social society and the British political realm. And so to get in the good graces, they end up fighting for the Hanovers rather than against them. And to ensure the movement could not rise again, the state implemented several radical changes. So essentially dismantled the clan system. The Heritable Jurisdictions Act of 1746 ended the feudal power of chiefs over their clansmen, essentially made it hard for them to be able to gather um, uh, their clansmen in a militia. Um, uh, the Brits also created a military road network in the Highlands, and they mapped the Highlands. It was easier for them to navigate. They found it really hard to navigate during the risings. Another one is the Act of Prescription in 1746, outlawed Highland dress, so tartan, symbols, that kind of a thing, unless it was worn in military service. So the impact of this is debated amongst historians because it was eventually repealed in 1782. But I think it's important to note because it just shows you how strong some of those symbols were to the movement and the message that they carried afterwards. And then also Episcopalian clergy, unfortunately, were arrested and incarcerated as well. As for Charles, he eventually falls out with the French royal court. His behavior in drinking became a problem, and and I do want to note that in 1759 there was one more invasion attempt by France, but that also failed. So we're at the end here, but historians like to argue about the legitimacy of the Jacobite movement as a real political movement. Is that the case? What do you think? Why did it fail? It's a tough question to answer. It's one that we approach cautiously in history. Hindsight is 2020, but it's hard to know how things might shake out given one or two things that change. However, critics might point out that the Jacobites really could only go as far as they did with the help of continental powers like France. So it's worth asking if France's attempts to invade had succeeded, would that have changed the outcome? Would that be something different? Secondly, you probably heard this throughout, but there was a real lack of synchronization and coordination between various Jacobite groups, but especially with France. Invasion fleets were often thwarted, and then there was just continual infighting, both religiously and politically, within the Jacobite leadership, which didn't help. And then lastly, the nobility were easy to persuade with titles and bribes as they were offered reintegration into the British social elite. So I call that some noble flip-flopping. So today there's a strong cultural legacy. This started once the political threat had kind of died sometime in the 1780s. Jacobitism was safe to romanticize. Robert Burns wrote several songs and poems rooted in Jacobitism in the late 19th century. And then we've got, of course, Sir Walter Scott's novels like Rob Roy and Waverley that elevated and romanticized the Jacobite cause as well. His continued interest in preserving Scotland's history through story and materials has made an incredible impact today. The emergence of what historians call Highlandism can kind of be traced back to this period and to Scott. Um, his efforts to bring romanticized symbols of Scotland and Scottish identity into the fold of British identity helped propel this. So, in one way, and I think this is so interesting, Sir Walter Scott organized and orchestrated King George IV's visit to Scotland in 1822. It's called the King's Jaunt. It was the first time a ruling monarch had visited Scotland since 1651, and it was meticulously planned and executed. It was laden with tartan, bagpipes, heather, um, Highland brigades, other symbols of Scotland, and George IV had his own Highland outfit. He showed up in that. And after this, we see an increased interest in the Highlands from the British monarchs and the English elites. So it became fashionable to wear tartan in the 19th century. Not too long after that was banned or it was seen as a sign of rebellion. Queen Victoria, especially, was drawn to the Scottish Highlands. And so Scottish identity kind of merges in with overall British identity in a way. And a lot of that can be traced back to some of the things in this period. And then, of course, today, modern legacy. We have what we call shortbread tin tourism. So the best way I can describe that is just like some of those tourist shops that you might see if you're in Edinburgh up and down the Royal Mile, with the plaid and the tartan and basically all the things that we love. Sometimes it's associated with vague anti-authoritarianism. And of course, we see it in literature, in books and TV shows like Outlander, where um, it is all the rage and romanticized. So that's the end of the lecture. I hope that you learned something new. I hope that you learned something interesting. For me, I think what I really love about this period is there's so many different moving parts. There's lots of things going on. There's a wrestling with Scottish identity, national identity. There's involvement with all kinds of different groups for different reasons. There's European involvement. And yeah, so if you like to read and if you're really into history books, then I definitely recommend The Jacobites by Daniel Zecchi. If you are really into military history and you want to know like all the inner workings of the battles and things like that, I recommend Culloden by Murray Pittock. And then another great resource is The Jacobite Risings in Britain by Bruce Lendman. So, um, I think with that said, uh, if there are any questions, feel free to speak up.